has aid itself become another chain for imperial occupations?
Palestine is known as the fruit basket of the Mediterranean, lost their economic lifeline, stripped completely of any political rights.
Irish potato famine. Many consider it genocide.
Over 1 million died.
Adam Smith said, if we were to intervene to feed the people, that would be worse. Nature's way of rebalancing. Africa needed charity because colonialists pillaged the entire continent. France has the highest amount of gold, yet they don't have any gold mines.
26 million Sudanese facing acute food insecurity. Humanitarian aid, it is weaponized, resembling Squid Games.
Aid organizations run like a business model. The money is coming straight back.
Designed to permanently manage them as refugees. Aid was not to restore independence, but lock them into dependency.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to another episode of Talking Point. If you're new, then don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And of course, we'd love to hear from our listeners. So if you like what you hear, share, and please send us your feedback. You'll also find us on Instagram and Spotify. Today, I'm your host, Farhana. With me, I have Shagufta and Zakia. Assalamu alaikum to you both.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
How are you guys?
Alhamdulillah, good. Jazakallah khair.
I think it's a pretty heavy topic this week, as a lot of them are.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Okay, so let's start, inshallah. So since October 2023, Gaza is still enduring a destruction on a scale rarely seen in modern history. And to date, over 100,000 tons of explosives have flattened neighborhoods, schools, masajid and churches, and nearly all water and sewage systems and the like have all been destroyed. And most likely hundreds of thousands have been murdered. And this number is, subhanAllah, increasing on a day-to-day basis. And, I remember vividly the videos of families that were gathering body parts of their children in plastic bags, the decimation of hospitals one by one, doctors with decades of education, skills that they've built up, the expertise, they have been murdered or kidnapped, and they've just been branded as terrorists. So Gaza is simultaneously under attack and being turned into a man-made death camp, where people are killed by not just bombs, but by starvation, disease, and the engineered collapse of life itself through the destroyed infrastructure and through the destroyed communities from the displacement. And our discussion today is, in the face of all of this, the world talks about aid, medicine, charity campaigns, and states want to talk about food drops, and they offer words of condemnation. But aid does not stop the bombing. Seems obvious. Neither do words. It does not rebuild hospitals. It doesn't restore the stolen futures, nor does it make up for the whole families that have been wiped off the registers in Gaza. And so this brings us to the subject today of humanitarian aid. When Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta was asked about humanitarianism, he stated that the current form of humanitarian aid became justification for imperial occupations.
If we think about the evolution of this current form of humanitarianism that started in the early 70s and then moved until it became a justification for imperialist occupation interventions, we see that it's based on this idea that the job of the humanitarian sector is only to address the consequences of ill-justice. And this idea that humanitarianism should be apolitical, otherwise it betrays itself, rather than siding with the oppressed and, more importantly, ending the causes of ill health. I mean, the whole idea in medicine is that you need to prevent ill health, and in these circumstances, the ill health is the occupation and settler colonial.
And the settler colonial project. So the question is no longer how much aid Gaza actually needs. The question is, has aid itself become another chain? Has it become another chain in holding the Palestinians in place while their destruction continues? So my first question is to Shagufta, and we're going to talk a little bit about the reality and the history of aid in Palestine. When did Palestinians first start to receive aid, and what changed?
Palestinians only began to receive aid after they'd been expelled from their land. Prior to this, Palestine was a land of self-sufficiency and prosperity. Its agriculture, in particular, was so abundant that it wasn't just feeding itself, but Palestine was exporting. Everybody's probably heard of Jaffa oranges. They were internationally renowned by the 1930s. Palestine was actually the world's second largest citrus fruit exporter, exporting like tens of millions of crates every year to Europe and beyond. According to economic historians, this part of Palestine in particular was known as the fruit basket of the Mediterranean. And it had a thriving industry in olives, in grains, in textile, and trade. It was a trading hub. This changed with the British Mandate and the Nakba of 1948. We know that over 800,000 Palestinians were expelled, made refugees, killed, and more than 500 villages were destroyed. They lost their land, they lost their businesses, they lost their economic lifeline. And what was once an exporting nation turned into a refugee population, which was now stripped of its independence. So then just 1 year later, in 1949, the United Nations established this body, UNRWA, and this was created supposedly as a temporary agency to look after the needs of these refugees until they could return. But of course, they've never been allowed to return. And UNRWA has become like a permanent mechanism for managing Palestinians as refugees, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Syria as recipients of aid. No longer citizens, no longer farmers, no longer traders, stripped completely of any political rights for decades. UNRWA has, it's been framed as this humanitarian lifeline, without which, where would the Palestinians be? But actually, it functions as a containment system to contain them in this permanent position of refugees. It provides schools, it provides clinics, it provides food. No one can deny that. But this is all within the framework of a people who have been stripped of their sovereignty. And it's actually not designed at all to empower the Palestinian people to, in any way whatsoever, reclaim their land or rebuild their economy. It's designed to permanently manage them as refugees, as a humanitarian population of people, not people or nation who are entitled to any kind of liberation from their occupation. So aid didn't start because Palestinians couldn't survive. Aid started because there was a colonial project that destroyed their ability to survive. And aid was brought in not to restore their independence, but actually to lock them into dependency.
It's really interesting because my father-in-law was displaced during the Nakba, and he studied in one of these UNRWA schools, and he reached higher education. He talks about the opportunities that this setup gave him. Yeah, so he ended up being an engineer. He got a scholarship to Egypt, and he's, considered to be like a success story. Yeah. But prior to the Nakba, he lived in Haifa. They had their own land for farming. They had a thriving community. They had horses, reasonable wealth that they could feed off their own land. And they used to travel to different parts of the region, Palestine. They ended up living in a cave after they were displaced from Haifa, and then to a tent. And so to this day, like, their family is split between West Bank and Jordan. And even in the West Bank now, the IOF have actually emptied out their camp after completely destroying all the roads, the sewage, and homes. And so in hindsight, what would you say to people that say that these humanitarian orgs have been used as an instrument to control the situation?
The first thing I'd say is we need to ask ourselves, how is it that people who were not just self-sufficient prior to occupation, but used to export food, how is it that up to October the 7th, they were actually in need of 500 trucks per day? How did they even get to that? And someone somewhere had sat down and done the calculation that is what's the minimum number of trucks required to meet their basic needs. What does that mean? That means for survival, not to thrive. That means just not to die. And that is the number that was allowed in, 500 trucks. This is the minimum that they need. And then after October the 7th, this number has plummeted to less than 100 trucks. And even that on just some of the days. That's less than 20% of what is needed for survival on just some of the days. It's actually calculated starvation. And that's just with regards to the trucks. But, I mean, if you move away from the trucks and you look at the aid distribution points, all of us saw in February of last year, the so-called flower massacre. We all saw it on our phones. At least 118 people were killed. More than 760 were injured while they were queuing up for food. They were told to go to this particular location to collect the flour. And when they were there, queuing up for it, they were killed. And this isn't just an isolated incident. It's been confirmed that over 1,300 Palestinians by the middle of this year have been killed while trying to actually access food and aid. So imagine that, you starve the people and then you kill them at the place where you tell them to go and collect the food from. And you asked, how has this control manifested? If we go back to the Oslo Accords and the peace process and the peace talks that were taking place at that time, they even used aid as political control. So the Palestinian Authority, it was set up in the 1990s, and it came with the promise of billions of dollars in international aid. But this was tied to the fact that this new founded Palestinian Authority must comply with Israel on security coordination in the West Bank. Then you'll get the aid. You'll get all these billions in international aid, but only if you comply with your occupier in security measures to keep you occupied. There's actually no wonder that for most people, the PA stands for public authority. And critics like Edward Said, he said that the PA had become an aid-dependent subcontractor occupation. So humanitarian aid is an instrument of control by being restricted, by being militarized, and through organizations like UNRWA and the PA, it is institutionalized into systems that exist and that are used to control people's lives, to contain them. And this is not just in Gaza, it is in the West Bank also. Now it's actually moved on from keeping them alive to something else altogether.
In the same presentation that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Ghassan Abusita actually uses the interesting phrase. He says evolution of humanitarian aid. He's referring to the American proposal at that time. So this presentation was about 3 months ago, of a new humanitarian setup. And he basically calls it a humanitarian concentration camp, which obviously sounds so ironic. He's referencing the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that many of the listeners are now very familiar with. But I'd like you to unpack what is the GHF and why did, I think, something like over 170 NGOs and UN personnel call to dismantle it.
Okay, so the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is actually the perfect case study of this next new level that humanitarian aid has reached, and that it is now weaponized. It was established by the United States and Israel this year as a new model for distributing aid in Gaza. And their idea was to create these very tightly controlled hubs, zones, where civilians would go to collect food. But in practice, and we can also see by design, it was, and so has become, lethal. It's actually an extension of the siege and an extension of the genocide. Within weeks of its creation, these hubs became kill zones. By July, figures confirmed that over 850 people had been killed at or near these sites, and many observers described it as the Palestinians are paying with their lives to get food. Eyewitnesses described it as resembling Squid Games. This is why many all around the world have called for the GHF to be shut down. It reroutes aid through these channels, which are controlled by the same military force that is imposing the siege and carrying out the genocide in the first place.
Obviously, this is a horrible mutilation of what humanitarian aid is supposedly stands for. I don't think you can deny the good that some of these humanitarian aid groups, these foundations have done, right? We saw, especially in the beginning of the genocide, where you had people like UNRWA, Red Cross, Red Crescent, down on the ground distributing food as much as they were able, because remember the blockade began very, very early on. That was one of the first things that happened, where they didn't let any food or water come in, medical supplies. And Farhana was saying how your father-in-law benefited from the schools that were set up. So there are well-intentioned people. They're not all out there trying to Squid Games the population and participate in the genocide. And obviously this GHF is like a complete, I can't even think of the word, but they've turned it into something so evil, the antithesis of what we all imagine humanitarian aid and the goodness that inspires it to be. But, just as you were talking, Shagufta, and we've talked about this at length on our series about Palestine, about how the irony of people like the US and Britain and France and all these Western countries being directly responsible for the creation of the problem of the Zionist entity and how this genocide even, why we are where we are today, and then to come in with this, it feels almost insulting, like this gesture of peace of like, well, here, I'm going to give you this aid. And I was looking at humanitarian aid, like on a global kind of context, and there was this speaker, he's like a young CEO of this African magazine, Ventures Africa. And he was saying how philanthropy is supposed to be this charity towards another human being, right? Goodness towards another human being. But the irony of, when you think of charity towards Africa and that sort of thing, the only reason Africa needed charity was because British colonialists went and pillaged the entire continent, alongside the French and the Belgians, etc. So in his speech, he was saying, and this was in Geneva, he was saying it shouldn't be philanthropy, it should be reparations. It's not this white savior complex of I'm doing such a good thing and I'm on my moral high ground. It's really, this is the bare minimum of what you should be giving back to these places for the horrors you have wrought upon them historically and continue to today.
That's right. There is definitely a difference between humanitarianism and humanitarian aid in the context that we're obviously discussing it, because humanitarianism is something that comes from within, the need to help others, to help other communities. It comes from a place of deep concern, and no way, shape or form is this down to the ordinary people who are looking at so many oppressed communities that are in such dire need of help. However, the focus of the discussion is obviously humanitarian aid that is ultimately, what we can see is that it's under government control. This is what we have. This is what we're discovering now. So we know Gaza is not just a one-off case. If you go further back, the Irish potato famine, for example, many Irish consider it to be a genocide because of the number of people that died and the political ramifications that surround it. And the Bengal famine as well, another genocide that people are calling it now, again, due to the number of people that died and because of the purposeful nature in the way that this famine / genocide was constructed. What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. We're taught that the Irish Great Famine was caused by potato blight, leading to the loss of the potato harvest. But actually, over 1 million Irish died and another 1 million emigrated. And when you look at it, the real story is actually one of colonialism, because Ireland had food. But during those years, the Irish were being forced to export huge quantities of that food. And, that's the case for wheat, oats, meat, butter. To who? Why would they export when they were undergoing a famine? Because they were colonized. This food was being sent to Britain in 1847, the worst year of the famine. Records show that actually hundreds of thousands of gallons of butter left Irish ports to England. So, yeah, this was a famine born out of colonial British policy. And colonial records show that they were actually othered. Irish Catholic were othered. They were seen as inferior, they were seen as lazy, they were seen as an undeserving people. And, Charles Trevelyan, who was in charge of famine relief, he called the famine, in quotes, a direct stroke of an all-wise providence, unquote, which took place, in his beliefs, to actually reform Irish society. It's just disgusting, sickening stuff. And you could ask, did the British really do nothing to help? Well, some relief was provided, but it was done in a way that actually humiliated and it controlled the Irish. So it forced them into workhouses, into conditional schemes in return for food. Hunger was weaponized to discipline what the British thought were a troublemaker, lazy population. And yeah, this is the ugly face of colonialism.
I think the other thing that's so infuriating is the word famine. When you use it, it just seems, oh, there was a blight of the crops, there was a fungal infection, and that's why they starved. Or it's something very force of nature, or there was nothing we could have done about it. Like the Bengal famine, which became, is probably one of the most well-known ones in India that you were talking about, Farhana, because it was Churchill era, it was during one of the world wars, 3 million people died. But this was not the only famine. In the 190 years that Britain had colonized India or had significant control over India, there were 34 separate famines.
Wow.
And prior to them, in the past 2,000 years, they only had 17 recorded famines.
SubhanAllah.
So you've gone from, it's the same land, it's the same monsoon seasons, it's the same cycle of rain and drought and crops. And, it's not like anything in the land, in the earth has changed. And yet somehow the British move in, and between 1850 and 1899, less than 50-year period, you've got 24 major famines, which is the highest number compared to any other 50-year period. And when you look into it, because, when you've got say you've got, one bad thing happens and you're like, oh, this is a one-off. Maybe it was just the drought. But if you're having it almost every other year, you've got a famine.
I was going to say, how can you have that many famines in that short space of time?
Something systemic, something deliberate is going on. Since they got independence, suddenly the famines disappear. So, what's the common denominator here? And there are so many university research papers in the World Economic Forum that have discussed the principles that underlay all of these very deliberate decisions by the British. So just like in Ireland, where they deliberately enforced exports despite the starving population. Same thing was happening in India, where all those railroads, which now they claim, oh, this was such an amazing gift the British left for India, what a great resource that we modernized the country. Well, really what those railways were used for was to export the grain to the ports so that it could be exported back home to Britain and other parts of the world so that the empire could gain its money. It also was used to transport grain out for hoarding. Peasant farmers were required to give about up to 50% of their revenue in tax, which meant normally in a farming cycle, if you've got a good year, good harvest year, you will save some of it in case the next year is a lean year. You will have your fail-safes in place because you know that you're in a land where you've got high rainfall, droughts, etc. You prepare, right? This was not the first time the Indian people had farmed. But when you're taxed so heavily, 50% of everything that you make, you have to give to your imperial masters, and then whatever's left, you have to give to the landowners. you have barely enough to get by, never mind prepare yourself for when disaster strikes, like a drought. And then on top of that, if you have just enough to survive to eat, you don't have anything to crop to plant next year. So then you have to borrow more money and more crops from your landowners, which only puts you further in debt. So you see how this cycle is perpetuated and the people are just left with nowhere to go. There were actual key theories and specific ideas that were underpinning these decisions. It wasn't just happenstance or just simply, oh, there were some greedy people that were informing this policy. It was very much capitalist ideology at the time. And we know, I'm sure lots of our listeners would have heard of Adam Smith, one of the fathers of capitalism, a great economist, as he is lauded in the West. And his main principle of the government shouldn't interfere in the free market, that the free market should be absolutely free. And what that means is that the people who are selling the goods, who own the goods, get to dictate the market price, and the government should not intervene, even in the situation, say, where there's a widespread famine, people can't afford to buy the crop. No, government should not step in, should not tell the people who own the crop, saying, you should bring down the prices because people can't eat, right? So they believed this with such strength in their ideology that they said, actually, if we were to intervene to feed the people, that would be worse. And then the second theory that they operated under was this Malthusian theory, right? Where Malthus said there's overpopulation and that's why people are starving in the world. Oh, there are too many people in Africa and that's why you see all these sad, UNICEF ads on TV, because the Malthusian theory was that the population grows exponentially and food supply grows linearly, which means that your population essentially is growing faster than your food supply. So inevitably, it's going to lead to crises like famine or war or disease when population outnumbers basically what your supply is. And it's almost nature's way of rebalancing the number of people you have because they're going to naturally die out because there are just too many of them. Now, you can see how a government adopting these kind of ideas, and they still do today, I'll be point blank honest with you, it's so convenient for them to say, well, this is how it works. But this is not how the world was always meant to be, obviously. And it's not even how India always operated, because if you go back to the 13th century, under the rule of Alauddin Khilji, who was Sultan of India under the Islamic Caliphate in the 13th century, they had, droughts and periods where there was less food to go around. But they managed it and they mitigated it, and they didn't have this widespread death of millions of people because the state regulated the food supply. It would control the prices and the transport. It would ration consumption if they needed to. It banned hoarding, right? It took action against hoarding. You weren't allowed to just stockpile all this grain if the rest of the population was starving. And it went a step further even after the famine period, where the state would step in and support farming. And Morland, a historian, noted that the successful use of price control and regulation of supplies by Alauddin Khilji was highly organized intelligence, and he rationed when needed, control transport, etc. All those measures that I was talking about before. So it's not just a natural state of that part of the world, as we're sometimes led to believe. These were deliberate policies by those in charge because their bottom dollar was more important than the number of human lives at stake.
I was going to say that it sounds like one is about viewpoint, about the way in which that you actually hold yourself accountable as a government and how you look at people. And the other thing is that it seems to only start from an occupation of some sort. That's when the history of that nation or that land starts. And had you gone back prior to occupation, colonization, you can see that the situation was very different.
I just wanted to add to what you were saying, Zakia. Isn't it the case that when we're told of the famine, it was Churchill who blamed the Indians and, quote, said it's their own fault for breeding like rabbits, unquote. This was a mentality, a way of thinking about the people of the land that they had colonized. The other thing I wanted to just say about the Irish famine is that we can contrast the way the British colonizers responded to how the Ottoman Caliphate at the time responded. It was Sultan Abdul Hamid II who sent aid at that time, in aid to Ireland, and he restricted it because Queen Victoria told him he could only send £1,000 because she herself had only pledged £2,000, and she did not want to be upstaged by the Muslims. So he sent £1,000 publicly, but then secretly he also spent 3 ships of food directly to Ireland without telling the British. And local Irish accounts say that this is what led to the lasting relationship that exists between the Irish and the Palestinians, or the Irish and Muslims. They acknowledge the help they received. I also wanted to say, off the back of what you were saying, Zakia, the parallels with Gaza, they are chilling. Definitely it's the case that, food was available in both Ireland and India, but political policies blocked it. And we can compare it now to what's happening with the Rafah border with Egypt. This border is closed because of political policies, not because there are mountains that can't be crossed. And again, when aid is provided, it's done in ways that humiliate and control. If we look at the aid drops that are being done by Jordan and the UAE, they are humiliating aid drops from the sky into the sea. They are drops onto tents that have killed displaced families that are seeking shelter. So the parallels are just, they're there for anybody who wants to see them.
Yeah, there's a pattern that we are seeing. What would you say then to people who talk about situation currently? We are living in an age of modernity. We are now a progressive civilization. You're talking about a colonial world that doesn't exist anymore. We are now post all of that, and that Gaza does not represent the norm. What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this isn't just history. Yemen has been described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with millions facing starvation. As of this year, over 18 million people are facing food insecurity. And this is due to a Saudi-led blockade of Yemen, which is supported by Western powers. And the blockade and the war that are causing this crisis, they're not lifted. Aid is just barely managing that suffering. In Bangladesh, we have the Rohingya living in camps to this day for years, surviving on mere rations, with actually no path, no discussion, no way whatsoever to entertain a path to return to their homeland or to rebuild their lives. In Sudan, we have 26 million Sudanese facing acute food insecurity because war is blocking the aid. Africa is painted again and again as like this helpless, aid-dependent part of the world. That's all I can remember forever growing up with, Live Aid concerts and musicians trying to send humanitarian aid, when actually Africa is home to like 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. Uncultivated arable land. It could feed not just itself, but actually others. But why can't it? Because Africa is just indebted. Africa has its resources extracted. Africa has trade rules which keep it dependent on other nations. Somehow, Africa exports billions in raw resources every single year, but then has to receive aid, which comes with strings attached, to solve its own famine and hunger problems. Gaza is not unique. What we're seeing now is actually just the latest chapter in a long history of colonial famine and creating situations that require humanitarian aid, and then aid comes with strings. And this is a situation that's created by power and is created by empire to control and manage populations.
Just echoing what Shagufta said, I mean, those are staggering statistics. But, just as this was as late as December of last year, Malawi's government is demanding $309 billion in unpaid taxes and royalties from a US-based gemstone company for rubies that they'd exported from Malawi over the last 10 years. And this is just one teeny tiny bit. Do you guys all remember that tweet that went around about how France has, the highest amount of gold, and yet they don't have any gold mines?
Yes.
This is the kind of wealth and resource extraction that we're talking about, of how can these countries, which are so resource rich, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is blessed with so much in terms of natural resources. The oil flows underneath the grounds of the Middle East. How can they be indebted? How can Africa be starving when when the US owes them 300 billion for rubies? And that's just rubies.
When you were talking about the Rohingya genocide, I remember the enormous aid efforts at that time. And there were many people that were traveling to Bangladesh. There was a particular brother, and he was making a video inviting people to send donations. And in the middle of him doing the video, he just kind of just broke down, and he just started talking about the level of devastation that was around him. And he just lost his composure, and he started sobbing because he could see the reality and the level of helplessness that aid is not going to cut it. There was so much more to the situation than met the eye. And it was very emotional for him. We discussed in a previous podcast the role of the IMF and the World Bank. We talked about the fact that they are capitalist tools. But there was something that I came across called tide aid and structural dependence. Zakia, if you'd like to elaborate on this point.
This was something that was really eye-opening for me. And I think when I understood what tide aid was, that's when I finally got on board with this idea that, these humanitarian aid organizations on a governmental kind of level, they run it like a business model, like everything else. There's definitely something in it for them. And essentially, tide aid is where the donor country gives the money to the recipient country and has strict conditions on how the country can use the aid. And usually it's in investing in donor companies. So, for example, if the US gives money to, say, Malawi, the tide aid would be Malawi can only use US corporations or like railroad companies or building companies or whatever to develop their infrastructure. So really, the money that they're quote unquote donating is coming straight back to them, right? Under the guise of benefiting these countries. You might argue, well, in the end, the country that's receiving the donation, they're still getting something out of it. But that is not entirely true, because what you're doing is you're not allowing the country to develop, to stand on their own 2 feet, to actually improve and progress in a way that they will become self-sufficient or increase their GDP or, no longer rely on the IMF for further bailouts and loans. But if you tie the aid so tightly to your own corporations, like the US does, like Japan, Korea, Germany, like they all do, then all you're doing is making these countries more reliant on these donor countries.
I just wanted to add to what you were saying. I read up that the US, when it gives out food aid, it requires the recipients to purchase actually American food and then even ship it on American ships. So it increases the cost for the countries receiving this aid, and it makes sure that the profit and the money goes actually straight back to the US. And not just the money, but actually interest on top of that. And it's not just the US, but in the 2000s, Canada tied aid to wheat purchases, where it forced actually African states to buy surplus Canadian grain instead of sourcing cheaper local food. So it's exactly what you were saying, Zakia, in the sense that it puts local producers out of business because their own government can't buy from them. They have to buy from foreign nations. It's not aid, it's actually business and profit.
The US had a very similar clause in their donation, in their aid scheme, where they force places like South America, you've got corn is one of the staple producers, and they make plenty of it. But because they were forced to buy US corn at a much higher price, instead of, say, buying it for $2, you're buying it for $10 or $100 because of inflation, etc., then you're putting the smaller businesses, like you're saying, completely out. And so you're killing local businesses and you're consolidating, you're giving that market monopoly to these big conglomerates.
So you mentioned, Zakia, structural adjustment programs. I mean, the IMF, through its loans in the 1980s and 90s, packaging these loans as aid as loans, trying to help these countries and lift them out of poverty. It forced countries all over Africa, Asia, Latin America to privatize industries, to cut social spending and open their markets in return for the loans. And it's well documented that this led to mass unemployment. It led to reduced healthcare, reduced education. It actually deepened poverty, and it led to higher child mortality. Just to give you another example, Zambia, it was the copper mines in particular that were privatized. What did this result in? 70,000 miners losing their jobs. Social services collapsed. Poverty deepened. In Ghana, it was the cocoa farmers who were hit.
I think what's important is to explain also to our listeners like what privatization is, because it's like a economic term which is kind of like thrown about, and like even I didn't understand it till I started looking into it. But it's the idea of you sell these public assets that the government or the state owns and give it to the private sector. So you're taking, so say if you, what was the country you were saying with the copper mines?
It was Zambia. Zambia was forced to privatize its copper mines.
Right. So before, if Zambia's got copper mines and it's a state government owned copper mine, right? All of the revenue that comes from that copper mine will be put back into the state, put into things like schools and roads and building. You can see how that would strengthen a country, right? And would help them develop. But if this copper mine then becomes privatized, and this is a condition of the loan that the IMF, the World Bank is giving you, that means that that copper mine now has to be transferred into the possession of an individual or a group of individuals. That wealth now suddenly, instead of benefiting the whole of Zambia, is benefiting the few owners of that copper mine. And so you can see how you're literally, it sounds like a tiny word on paper. I'm going to privatize the mine. I'm going to privatize water. I'm going to privatize gas. I'm going to privatize ruby mines, whatever it is. And suddenly that wealth that belonged to the people, to the state, only belongs to the few. And you know how we sometimes sit here and we're like, how did the 2% get so rich? Like, how did those elites become so rich? And one of the main ways is this privatization of wealth, right? That before would benefit everyone, and now it's just benefiting a few business owners. Now, these structural adjustment plans, which are a condition of the loan. So what that means is the IMF doesn't just give you $1 billion loan, say to Pakistan, for example, or Sierra Leone, and say, here's $1 billion. Use it how you see fit. You know the country. You can put it into the resources that you think are going to develop your country and get it out of poverty. Because the fact is, since 1960, the per capita income gap between the global north and the global south has quadrupled. Why are we getting more poor in the global south compared to the global north if we've been getting billions of dollars in loans and aid for the past 60 years? It doesn't make sense. And the reason are these structural adjustment clauses, right? These conditions. So for example, they tend to do it on 4 main sort of key areas, right? And this has been going on for a long time, since the 90s, like Shagufta was saying. Privatization of state assets, so taking that wealth away from the state and giving it to private individuals. Number 2, forcing free markets. So you know how if you've got a struggling population and you've just got your independence post-colonialism, for example, right? You're not going to have a lot of money in the country. And the best way to kind of bolster your economy, bolster your people, would be for the government to do something and be like, hey, I'm going to subsidize the price of like food and fuel so that you guys don't have to worry about it and you can work and develop and we can make money for the country together. No, they say, let's force the free markets. Let's let the people who are selling the stuff like oil to hike up the prices, which you can imagine obviously is going to put your local people into real trouble. Number 3, they force the governments to increase taxes. And this is so that if the government or the country's economy collapses, they will still be able to pay the loan. So they can pay their debts. And number 4, they force the government to cut spending and actually dictate how governments spend their money within their own governmental structure. Like this blows my mind. But I was watching this, I listened to this report, right? So they did a whole deep dive onto the IMF and the structural adjustments. And one of the examples they gave was Sierra Leone during the Ebola crisis in 2013. That's not that long ago. 2013. The IMF dictated a limit on how much the government could spend on government workers. And as a result, the government had to cut the number of medical staff in their hospitals and the Ministry of Health. The IMF also asked them to decentralize decision-making, which sounds insane, but it means that when something like Ebola hit, you had no center to, organize relief efforts. You had not enough people in the health ministry to research vaccines or cure, or doctors to go out and administer treatments to people in the hardest hit areas. It was really hard to have a coordinated effort. And the government cut spending prior to the Ebola outbreak. They cut spending on the infectious diseases department so that they could prioritize paying back the debt on this IMF loan. So it sounds like, oh, well, I'm sure it doesn't actually hurt them, but it does. It really does. And what you're seeing in real time is the IMF is giving money and getting the soft power of looking like this great benevolent force and helping these countries, when in fact, it's really just an extension of what the colonialists were doing in the first place, right? This shackling all the wealth and resources and dictating where it goes. So like in the tide aid example, you're dictating where they're spending their money and giving it back to them, bringing it back to the homeland.
I just wanted to add to what you're saying. I mean, whether it's Gaza and Palestine, which is being prevented from rebuilding self-sufficiency, or whether it's the African nations, the principle really is the same. Aid, whether it is humanitarian aid or financial aid, when this aid is propelled by capitalist thinking and capitalist ideas, it just creates dependency. And dependency for the capitalists entrenches control. And what does control do? Control for the capitalists strengthens their empire. And strengthening the empire means that they can continue to exploit and continue to extract and continue to maintain their dominance over whoever they class as the others. And that's the bottom line, whether it's financial aid or it's humanitarian aid. Aid does not liberate. Aid actually just manages the symptoms while keeping the root causes completely intact. And it makes sure that that liberation never happens, and that the nations remain tied to the same system that is causing the problems and is now giving the aid, whether it's humanitarian or it's financial.
There's a reason why the leaders of the World Bank and the IMF are not elected. They're nominated by the US and Europe. And there's this unspoken agreement that the president of the World Bank, and you can look this up, has always been from the US. And the president of the IMF has always been European, right? And in the IMF, when they vote and they decide, where does this aid money go? Who are we going to spend it on? Who do we give our loans to? They have votes. And gradually, as various ex-colonies gained independence, they slowly joined the IMF. And yet in the IMF, a British person's vote is worth 40 times more than a Bangladeshi's vote and 23 times more than a Nigerian's vote.
So I guess we conclude that we are not in a post-colonial world. We are very much within the colonial structures. So before we move on to our last segment, I came across an opinion piece today by a researcher who specializes in Islamic thought and movements and conflict resolution by the name of Hisham Ghafar. So this was in the Middle East Eye. And he writes, the question is no longer whether genocide is happening in Gaza, but how global economic and political systems, driven by a cannibalistic capitalist logic and shielded by political complicity, continue to turn human beings into expendable inputs, marketable products, or spectacles for consumption. This is the logic that sustains not just the ongoing destruction of Gaza, but the normalization of mass killing as a permanent feature of our shared global future. So people are talking about a systemic problem here. And you guys have obviously given a really good breakdown and examples that exist within the capitalist world order that we are living under right now. We can choose to ignore it, or we can actually choose to engage the situation that we are in. And so what does a principled Islamic framework look like? What does it look like in policy? And what does it look like when it comes to aid?
Okay, so Islam begins with a completely different view of the human being, where capitalism sees humans as economic units, as markets, as labor, or as consumers, where aid, whether it's humanitarian aid or financial aid, where it's filtered through this same lens, becoming a tool for influence or profit or control. Islam, by contrast, sees every single human being, Muslim or not, as someone to be honored, somebody with rights to dignity, with rights to justice, and rights to mercy, and food, shelter, and protection. They're not charity or bargaining chips. They're actually obligations that must be provided by those who are in authority. You know, relief is not about using it to leverage yourself politically or to loot a people. Relief is about ensuring justice is done, and it is tied to accountability. You know, history shows us this. During the famine of Khalif Umar bin al-Khattab, when he was in authority, he didn't outsource the provision of aid, and he didn't put conditions on food. He actually completely suspended punishments. He mobilized caravans of grain from other parts of the Muslim world, from Egypt and Iraq, and he personally shared in the hardship until the crisis ended. He refused to eat meat or butter until the people were able to eat meat or butter. You know, leadership for him meant a shared sacrifice and a shared responsibility. And it was about ensuring that justice and mercy are served through this responsibility and accountability.
Yeah, I think it's really key to contrast the perspective of a leader like Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, for example, versus Churchill during the Bengal famine, or any of the colonialist leaders at the time, where they were operating on, like I said previously, on those Adam Smith principles of free market trading. And it doesn't matter if people are starving, or the Malthusian theories of overpopulation, and that's why these war famines are all just inevitable. You know, when in the Quran we have the ayah in Surah An-Nisa where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us in ayah 135, "O believers, stand firm for justice as witnesses for Allah, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, or close relatives. Be they rich or poor, Allah is best to ensure their interests. So do not let your desires to cause you to deviate from justice." This is a really key part of the Islamic principles that the leaders throughout Islamic history, and we're not saying all of them were great, right? But this was one of the principles that they operated from. So, for example, we had the Abbasid Khalif al-Ma'mun in the 9th century, where he had a famine in Iraq due to severe drought. And he ordered the opening of the state granaries and suspension of taxes. And he distributed food to the poor. And he also instructed his provincial governors to prioritize famine relief over revenue collection. Your priorities should be the feeding of the people. It should not be, it doesn't matter if they've paid their taxes or not. They recognize that this was a situation that was extreme, and the priority was human life and justice over what I'm going to fill my coffers with. Even a non-Muslim, Karen Armstrong, has said in her book about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I quote, "At its core, Islam insists on social justice, fair distribution of wealth, and the protection of the vulnerable. Principles that were revolutionary in 7th century Arabia and remain relevant today." You had the Abbasid Khalif al-Muntasir in the 11th century, where the Nile in Egypt experienced one of the longest recorded low flow periods, which caused repeated crop failures. And what was his response? Again, he ordered the rulers to mobilize the grains and reserves. He imported food from other parts of the Islamic Caliphate from Syria and North Africa, and in some cases directly subsidized bread prices so that people could afford to buy bread. This is not British Empire sitting there forcing the Irish to be starved so that they could get all the grain and butter. This would be like if they decided, okay, let's take food from other parts of the empire and redirect it towards Ireland to feed them. Like, that was not even on their radar. That was nowhere going to be part of their policy because it directly went against their ideological beliefs. The foundation of their policy was not the preservation of human life or to be just to their people. It was directly about filling their coffers and what was most profitable for them. And so you can see in the Khalifa al-Muntasir, the rulers, what was really beautiful was the rulers at that time, they personally monitored the Nile flood levels and they adjusted taxation accordingly. But so they could see if there was a little bit more water, then they would adjust the taxes. If there's a little bit less water, they'd adjust the taxes so that the farmers were not burdened during the shortages, right? This is directly responding to a natural disaster, a famine, and mitigating the effects of that drought so that the people are prioritized. You can really see the difference in priorities and importance in what those rulers were seeking to achieve. And these weren't isolated people. It wasn't just a few good eggs, because we're giving examples throughout different centuries of history where this governing principle of justice in Islam was a common thread.
I just wanted to add to that, in Islam, there is this waqf system, which is like charitable endowments. Throughout Islamic history, it has created a civilization where hospitals, schools, water fountains, food kitchens have been funded entirely without profit. It was in the Ottoman Caliphate in particular where like nearly half of all property was endowed to public waqf at one point or another. Welfare and taking care of the needs of people, it wasn't an industry. It was actually a right enjoyed by every single citizen, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, and even people who weren't citizens. So you might be a traveler just passing through, but your needs were taken care of. Hunger today is not a matter of resources. The world produces more than enough calories to feed everyone. It is staggering and eye-watering and completely unbelievable that 1/3 of all food produced is actually wasted. And we have got to wake up to this, that this is political policy that leads to this. And we've got to start looking at alternative systems, and Islam provides such a system, a governance system that ensures that resources are actually distributed with justice and mercy, and that they are not hoarded or weaponized against any people, any human beings.
The discussion today started with Gaza. I wanted to bring in a quote from Dr. Sama Jabir, who is a psychiatrist in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And it's an article that she wrote in Mondawise. She writes, the distribution of dignity kits by governments and organizations that contribute to or are complicit in the ongoing siege and violence against Gaza is a glaring contradiction. While claiming to uphold dignity, they are instrumental in creating the conditions that strip away the Gazans' humanity and dignity. What is the meaning of this superficial gesture? What we have learnt, I think, from this discussion is that imperial powers manufacture crises, they create turmoil, they displace entire populations, and then they step in with these conditional aid, and that breeds dependency. This is control disguised as compassion. When David Cameron sends dignity kits to Palestinian women while the British government arms Israel's war machine, it doesn't make sense. Gaza is also not an anomaly. What we have seen is that around the world, that aid is used not to restore rights, but to manage refugees and to actually pacify the oppressed. And we are talking in the millions. Humanitarian aid has become an industry, a multi-billion-dollar business, and it sustains NGO rivalries, and it props up capitalist markets, and it gives this legitimacy to war and occupation. So rather than ending suffering, the survival is just enough for the oppression to continue. And until the situation in Gaza manifested itself, it wasn't at the forefront of our minds. So we have come to the conclusion that aid doesn't solve the crisis. It manages the symptoms, and it ensures that liberation is never achieved. There's been evidence of this. In each and every case, charity has only patched up survival, while the root problem of the colonization, of the occupation, has remained completely untouched. Capitalism is what turns these crises into markets. It manages misery, and it does this to ensure that the empire is able to sustain itself. And therefore, aid without justice becomes another weapon. However, Islam as a political system does offer a different ideological path. Where capitalism commodifies human suffering, Islam demands justice, not dependency. And I think we have to be real. How long can we accept a system that manages death instead of ending oppression? What Gaza, Sudan, and the Rohingya, and Yemen, and every colonized nation is in need of is systemic change. Liberation from capitalist dependency. That is ultimately what it has to look like. And we would posit that a return to Islam's model of dignity, justice, and sovereignty is what the world needs.